Welcome everyone to another episode of the ideaXme show, the show that focuses on the people and innovative companies that are moving the human story forward. I'm Amanda Christensen. I'm a deepfakes and media misinformation researcher, as well as marketing manager at Cubaka. And I have the pleasure of being joined by Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat of NYU, a historian and cultural critic. Ruth, it'd be great if you could take it away and introduce your background and how you came to be interested in the topic of democracy, history, and culture and their kind of intersection.
So I'm a historian specializing in fascism and authoritarian regimes. So propaganda and the way that leaders have manipulated people and gotten themselves to power, and then how they use misinformation as well as violence and corruption to stay in power. I've been studying that for many years. And so this background helps me to understand today what's going on around the world with a new wave of authoritarian leaders who use some of the same techniques, although the outcome might be different than the classic fascist regimes.
Fascinating. And looking at kind of recent ages as well, and the technological advancements that have made this so much easier to kind of subvert these democratic ideals, as well as take advantage of things like echo chambers and algorithms in order to further their own opinion. How have you seen things shift as technology has increased?
So it's as we well know, social media is a double-edged sword, right? It's hugely helped in organizing protests, and the famous examples in Hong Kong of using Apple AirDrop function and Tinder to organize and communicate, and in Russia as well. But of course, autocrats are having workarounds and banning platforms, and so it's a constant kind of interplay that breeds creativity on both sides. Another big difference between the past and the present is that classic authoritarian regimes, both communists and fascists, used censorship extensively. They had the heavy hand of censorship, and you had to have their alternate reality. Nowadays, through misinformation, Infowar experts like Putin's regime, what they like to do, and including Trump is a scholar of this, if he's a scholar of anything, is that you want to confuse people. You want to flood the zone with so much conspiracy theories, uncertainty, that people no longer know what the truth is. So you still have the charismatic leader, and he's supposed to convince you of the reality as he needs it to be. But there's also a dimension of, they use less censorship and more flooding the zone so that people no longer know what to believe, and it's easier to just follow the leader.
Definitely. And in a world where we have access to more information than ever before, it really puts the onus on the individual to do the extra research, to access information that they maybe had not been exposed to previously, or that they wouldn't in their natural circles. And this is now really easily exploitable, like you said, for Putin, for Trump, and particularly looking at the kind of crisis that governments are having in addressing reactions to major events like coronavirus, like the Black Lives Matter protests going on in the States, these kind of major events. What are your thoughts on kind of the spread and access of information and the responsibility on democratic leaders to kind of provide that, or whether that onus falls on the individual, whether that falls on the platform? How do you see the kind of best play?
So the leaders matter hugely in a crisis like a pandemic, and crises are a test of their willingness to be transparent and to be accountable. And accountability and transparency extend to, it's not just about the functioning of government. So, they're not going to, instead of hiding corruption, they're gonna air it and address it and try and stamp it out, but also information. So it's very interesting how in Brazil, and now we're hearing more about what Putin's done in Russia, and certainly with Trump in America, and Orban in Hungary, there was vast doses of misinformation put out by the leader in order to seem more competent, because so that like these kind of distraction maneuvers where both Bolsonaro and Trump were peddling false cures. They wanted to be the invincible male leader who has like a miracle cure, and so keep people believing in him. At the same time, they refused to have a proper program of mass testing, as some democracies did, because the higher, it's all about optics, basically. The more tests, the more cases get reported, and the worse they look. So the manipulation of information has very concrete public policy and health policy effects. And it's measured in the cost of lives that are, needlessly sacrificed to their propaganda campaigns.
So in response to this propaganda and misleading information, we've seen the likes of Twitter start putting notifications on tweets, particularly from Donald Trump. What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of this, as well as Trump's response in creating a new social media order, and how effective that will be in this perpetuation of misinformation?
It's still a very everything's very much an evolution. Trump would be, it's not that he'd be nothing without Twitter, but not that he can't have his rallies, which very, very important to the building of his personality. Twitter is more important than ever. And it's interesting that he, was so aggressive the minute that Twitter decided to fact check him. Although he knows that, if Twitter was going to take seriously, tamping down violence and extremism, they would have done other more comprehensive measures a long time ago. So it's almost like a toothless warning. And a lot of what Trump does is for the value of threat. So the way his psychology is, he had to lash out very, very harshly at anyone who tried to put any restriction on him, because that's part of his persona. But it remains to be seen, because again, it's always an interplay between what governments are doing and how social media platforms are going to respond to them. Jack does not have the same relationship with Trump as Mark Zuckerberg does, where we just learned yesterday or the day before that, they spoke on the phone before Facebook. They seem to be quite cozy. There's been numerous times where they've been speaking before any kind of policy is changed, and it's not completely clear. We know that Zuckerberg doesn't seem to want to oppose Trump particularly, and Trump's been highly successful with flooding, given Facebook so much money he has massive disinformation campaigns going on Facebook, which has a far bigger base, as you know, of users. So it remains to be seen, but I think that the dynamics are going to accelerate, and more pressure will be placed on social media platforms as the election gets closer.
Definitely, I definitely agree. And it was quite interesting, particularly to see Mark Zuckerberg denounce Twitter's notifications of this false information, or more information as well, particularly given that at the same time there was a report that was released from Facebook's internal team where they were warning each other about their algorithm's preference for this kind of novel information, and perpetuating these echo chambers that people are getting stuck into, and that make it really easy for politicians or really anyone to kind of manipulate and enforce their opinion. How do you see that kind of impact, I guess, looking the other way around? Will there be a push from large legislators to limit the effect that these algorithms have on the information that we have access to, or do you think we're still kind of too far behind in that element?
I think that whatever they might do in legislative time is not going to be able to keep pace with the rate, the scale and the speed of developments in social media. The Facebook example is also interesting because it came out that a large percentage of Facebook's employees who are in this sector were very against what Zuckerberg decided to do. So there's that problem. I know personally, because they've reached out to me, that there are many committees and research groups in Facebook that are trying to, they're concerned with how to do better with limiting extremism. I've talked to them. But if the command structure is such of the social media company that Zuckerberg calls the shots, even if the majority of his experts in that field are against it, there's not much that can be done. And that's why I think it's important to emphasize that Zuckerberg and Trump had directly their own meeting. It's like, and it doesn't matter what other people think or say.
Right. So, kind of looking ahead, we were talking about earlier how social media is both a blessing and a curse in terms of you have all of this access to information, and kind of the internet as a whole, you have all of this access to information, but there's a lot more onus on the individual. And looking at how history was recorded in time, obviously we compile our views on the information that we have accessed. In this new age, where there's so much information and people are trying to be either the loudest or most pervasive or kind of hone in on these target sectors, how do you suppose we'll evaluate history moving forward when there's so much to sift through?
I think at the larger level, what's been very clear, and I'll keep with the example of Facebook, is, recently there was pieces about Facebook acknowledges that it's been it's been an accelerant for polarization. And polarization has real world effects, because every time there's been an authoritarian regime, it's been preceded by periods of great political polarization between right and left, and two alternate realities, and a breakdown of horizontal bonds and civil bonds because of polarization. So now all of these processes that have always been true in history are hugely speeded up and accelerated and intensified by social media, the echo chamber thing. So I think we're going to look back at this period as a period of great, irresponsibility and lack of civic care and civic concern by the heads of the big social media groups. We don't know what their private political agendas are. Many people speculate, but as companies, they have not. We will look back and see how they are a kind of para-political actor, para-state actor almost, even though they're private companies, that did not do much and did a lot to harm democracy.
Definitely, whether they wanted to or not, regardless of kind of relationships that were established outside of it, it is a platform that they are able to then broadcast their beliefs to on a global scale. Something I'd like to get your opinion on would be Trump's recent tweet calling Antifa a terrorist organization. If you could break that down, especially given that our audience is quite international, if you could break that down both in regards to the kind of misinformation that it spreads in the kind of labeling itself, as well as the potential ramifications that this could have moving forward.
So it's important to note legally, his declaration that Antifa is going to be, called, it's going to be labeled as a terrorist organization. Legally, it has no teeth. It can't. It's not a group. It's a movement of many, many different actors. It's a loose coalition. So there's no one core that he can single out and say, like Al-Qaeda or something, that these are terrorists. So as usual with Trump, there was another meaning to that tweet. It's in the middle of protests, which have been marked by grave police brutality. And Trump always has different constituencies he's trying to reach. And one of them was the police, and also white extremists who there's some evidence they're infiltrating these protests and kind of trying to incite violence,
Mm-hmm.
because the logic is things become so violent that the state has to step in and do states of emergency, martial law, and then you have authoritarian solutions, let's say. So the audience of the tweet is very important to consider, but he's telling people, from white extremists to the police to the National Guard, that they can feel legitimated by the President of the United States to treat protesters as terrorists, meaning that that invites you to be brutal, to respect their humanity or their dignity because they're terrorists. So, you know, a lot of people say Trump is a madman or he's just like incompetent, but in anything to do with marketing and communication, he is extremely skilled. And he's invested a huge amount of time for 5 years now, cultivating through social media, through Twitter, through, recycling neo-Nazi memes. He's invested a huge amount of time in cultivating these groups. So that tweet has to be seen as an extension of that.
Definitely. And looking ahead, with these algorithms and with these groups and with these kind of personal targeting and looking kind of back at Cambridge Analytica and these scandals, how is the best way to ensure that we preserve democracy moving forward when we have all of these elements of our society that are so easily exploited?
Many people call for government regulation of social media groups, social media companies. It's all here. It really depends on the government in power. In the United States, there's not much hope that anything that is protective of democracy is going to have any traction right now, because the people in power are not fans of democracy. They are there to damage it. They are there to exert a more authoritarian vision of power and control of information. It's interesting that the world leaders who Trump admires are all autocrats. He never compliments democratic leaders. So one of the things he envies is their control of information. Their ability, again, it's not old school so much where you completely ban the opposition press. You leave a pocket of opposition, but you manipulate belief, or you go after media companies financially. You try and bankrupt them, you sue them. There's different ways of obtaining the result that only your voice and your allies' voice is heard. So it's not, if the government in question does not have a very concerted cross party, bipartisan, you say in the United States, effort to prevent disinformation and Cambridge Analytica ops of this sort, there's not much that we can do at the governmental level. Again, transparency and accountability, which is, those words are the enemies of operations like Cambridge Analytica. So it's a conundrum.
What about on a personal level? How can people ensure that they're kind of reaching the full breadth of information, that they're getting the whole story? It's quite hard to keep up with things when we're on a 24/7 news cycle. Everything is published instantaneously, and we are kind of guarded to some extent more than others by our own algorithms and Facebook feeds and news feeds.
One of the things I worry about is because we're all, it's a culture of instant reaction, and there are a few bad outcomes for democracy of this. One is that we spend our time, every moment that we spend responding to the latest outrage of the ruler, like Bolsonaro, who makes insults, or is time we're not stepping back and looking at the structural problems. Now, everything has exploded in the United States now because of these structural inequities. So we're at a very different point than if we'd had this interview 3 weeks ago. It's a different situation. But that's one thing, that it becomes harder and harder to step back and see the big picture, as news consumers, and Twitter and especially rewards frequent users. So it rewards people in the followers. Just even think about the term follower, that it's a follower and a leader. So each individual consumer has the ego boost of thinking, I have followers. But you have followers if you're constantly, reacting. And that is not reflection and conscientious, like reflection and reason and wisdom are the casualties of our instant action culture. We've seen a change in the news too, in mainstream news, where as time becomes more dense, many more things are happening. It's easy for news corporations to not step back anymore and give people the big picture. On the other hand, our autocratic times have actually revitalized investigative journalism, and that's very, very important. And they're constantly looking at the big picture. So it's not a completely bleak landscape. But one thing that these protests have in the United States have shown up is the sadness of the demise of local news, because if you have protests in neighborhoods, local news was always the way that you got the depth, and sometimes they had ties to people in the neighborhood, and all that is lost. And so you're depending on huge, news corporations to cover local events, and that's difficult.
Definitely, just the sheer scale of it all, looking at the United States, there's no possible way that the 4 or 5 major news broadcasters could cover completely everything. Expanding upon that, is there any real kind of silver lining? Are we looking at a more politically engaged community coming out of both the coronavirus pandemic as well as the Black Lives Matter protests and all of these kind of insurgencies of data breaches, or platforms kind of having a bit more of a sense of accountability towards them? Is there a silver lining in that moving forward?
Well, with coronavirus, there's nothing greater than a pandemic to show people the life and death consequences of misinformation. So unlike, and the other thing about the coronavirus is it's a leveler, because people who don't like people of color can say, well, that doesn't concern me. I'm not affected by that. Or they could say, I don't like people of color, and so I agree with what's being done. Coronavirus doesn't care about your faith, your age, your race, nothing. So there have been a number of people who, and in Brazil as well, the leaders are losing popularity because this issue has woken people up. And so accountability will become much more important. And again, that extends to accountability of information. We also have seen the importance of expertise. Authoritarian regimes hate experts because that's objective scientific opinion. And a pandemic shows that it's absolutely vital. It's life and death, right? So those are things which are hopeful. It's basically exposing the weakness of these anti-democratic leaders who don't like expertise, they don't like civic bonds, all of the things that we need to survive. So I am hopeful that some other kind of politics that's and a reminder of how important democratic values are will come out of this.
Thank you very much for your time today, Ruth. It's been absolutely fascinating. I know there's quite a lot that's happened in just the past couple of days on the topic, but it's been absolutely fascinating getting your take on the information, where we may be heading, and what governments as well as individuals need to do to ensure that we're getting kind of the most information that we can, and be truly diligent in the way that we act, and hopefully the way that we vote down the line.
Yes, well put. Thank you.